They took 1,400 acres from the son of a Mexican woman and an American man, but they didn't know whose land they were standing on. See how one man turned the tables. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The first light of dawn spilled softly across the dry hills that ring the Reyes Valley, casting the land in a pale gold that seemed to glow from within. Mornings on the ranch always began the same way for Miguel Ramos Clark, long before the sun had cleared the horizon. The cool air carried the scent of hay and the faint mineral tang of the creek that cut through the north pasture. Somewhere beyond the barn, the low sound of cattle shifting in their pens broke the stillness, joined by the rhythmic creak of the old windmill, pumping water into the troughs. Miguel moved through it all as naturally as breathing. He had been doing this since he was a boy, shadowing his father's stride, learning the lay of the land by heart, every rise, every patch of stubborn mesquite, every stretch of fencing that seemed to lean a little more each season. He walked the fence line in the dim light, pausing to test the tautness of the wire, straightening a post where the last storm had nudged it askew. In the east, the sky was streaked with rose and orange, promising another hot day. But for now, the world was still wrapped in the fragile quiet that always came before the heat took hold. This was the hour Miguel loved most, when the land spoke in its own way, and the rest of the world felt far away. He had spent his entire life here, on these 1,400 acres that his family had fought to hold on to for generations. His father, an American veteran who had returned from service to run cattle, and his mother, the daughter of Mexican field workers who had crossed the border in the 70s, had built this place together from nothing but grit and hard work. The ranch was more than just soil and grass to him. It was the living record of every sacrifice they had made. His father's sweat had soaked into this ground, with each fence repaired and each barn mended after storms. His mother's hands had planted the garden behind the house, cooked for the hired men in the summers when haying seemed endless, and kept the accounts in neat ledgers written in both English and Spanish. This land had endured drought, floods, and years when markets turned so badly they almost lost it, but it had never once been surrendered. Miguel carried that knowledge with him like an anchor, steadying him through whatever life threw his way. From the top of the southern ridge, he could see beyond the ranch boundary to where the valley floor flattened into neat rows of houses. The subdivision hadn't been there when he was a boy. Back then, the edge of their property had run into wild grassland and cotton fields. Now, smooth asphalt roads wound between cookie-cutter homes with clipped lawns and decorative mailboxes, the kind of place where rules about fence height and paint color were written into thick handbooks. The people who lived there were polite enough in passing, but they belonged to a different world, one of homeowners' committees, weekend barbecues, and whispered competition over whose yard looked best. Miguel didn't begrudge them their ways, but he had always felt the distance between their reality and his own. By the time he returned to the yard, the sun had cleared the ridge, and the shadows had begun to shrink. He was about to head inside for coffee when a white SUV with a company logo pulled up to the front gate. The driver, a young man in a crisp polo shirt, stepped out holding a thick envelope. He barely met Miguel's eyes as he asked his name, handed over the packet, and left without so much as a goodbye. Miguel stood in the driveway for a moment, the paper weight of the envelope in his hands sending a pulse of unease through him. His name was printed in bold, along with his father's, though his father had been gone for over a decade. The return address bore the seal of Pinecrest Residential Services, a name he didn't recognize. Inside, at the kitchen table, worn smooth by years of use, he broke the seal and unfolded the contents. The first page hit him like a blow. It was written in that clipped, clinical legal language designed to strip all humanity from the message. Formal notice of property reassignment due to abandonment and unpaid association dues. The document claimed that his 1,400 acres, his family's ranch, had been transferred to a development corporation aligned with the Pine Bluff Estates Homeowners Association. The words barely seemed real as his eyes scanned them again. Abandonment, unpaid dues, sale completed last week. He had never joined any HOA in his life, never signed a single agreement that could place his land under such authority. The sum listed for the transfer was insultingly low, the kind of figure meant for scrubland no one wanted. Not working ranch land that had been cared for and maintained without pause. He flipped through the pages, looking for any hint of mistake. Instead, he found a second statement, an official-sounding declaration that the property had gone unused and unmaintained for more than 3 years. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Only 2 weeks ago, he had mended a stretch of fence in the south pasture after a stray steer had pushed through. Every season, he moved cattle between fields, cut hay, rotated grazing areas. The notion that the land had been neglected wasn't just wrong, it was an outright lie. Leaving the documents spread across the table, Miguel strode to the small safe in the corner of his study. The combination lock clicked open under his fingers, revealing neat stacks of manila folders. He pulled out the one labeled Title Taxes and set it beside the notice. There was the original deed in his father's name, the legal transfer to his own name after the funeral. The latest tax receipts marked paid in full. Everything was in order, every detail correct. There was no debt, no abandonment, no cause for sale, which meant that what sat in front of him wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an attack. The name at the bottom of the notice was the first real clue. President of Pine Bluff Estates, HOA, Mariella Vance. The name stirred recognition. He had heard it in passing at the feed store, murmured in conversations about new developments and land deals. A polished woman, they said, with connections to builders and bankers, always moving pieces in her favor at community meetings. Miguel had paid little attention before. She belonged to that other world, the one beyond his fence lines. But now her reach had crossed into his, and the consequences were staring at him from the paper. He pushed back from the table and went to the window, looking out at the land that stretched toward the horizon. Every pasture, every live oak casting its shadow, every bend of the creek was tied to his family story. His father had often told him that land was more than a possession. It was a trust passed from one generation to the next, a responsibility to guard and nurture. That trust had survived every hardship they had faced, but now it was under threat from people who had likely never set foot on the property they were trying to claim. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. He called the county clerk's office, waited on hold for nearly an hour before a clerk finally confirmed that, according to their records, the property had been sold by the HOA to the development company. When Miguel asked where in those records the HOA's ownership was documented, the answer was blunt. It wasn't. Still, the paperwork was filed, and in the eyes of the county, the transfer had been made. To undo it, he would need proof, hard, undeniable proof, that the HOA had no right to sell what they didn't own. By midday, the sun was high and the air heavy with heat, but Miguel barely noticed. The envelope lay open on the counter, its contents fanned out like evidence at a crime scene. His mind kept circling the same questions. How had they pulled this off? Who had helped them? And how much damage could they do before he stopped them? He thought of his mother, of the years she had worked beside his father to keep the ranch alive. He thought of the long history in every fence post and the quiet pride in every harvest. The idea of losing all of it to a piece of fraudulent paper ignited something deep in him, something immovable. As the day wore on, he began pulling together what he would need: deeds, tax receipts, photographs, witness statements if it came to that. He didn't yet know how far this fight would go, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had chosen the wrong man to try and push aside. This land wasn't abandoned, and neither was he. The notice might claim a sale had been made, but in his mind, the ranch was still his, as unshakable as the roots of the oaks that had stood here for 100 years. Whatever it took, he would make sure it stayed that way. By evening, the light was fading over the valley, casting the subdivision in shadow, while the last glow lingered on the high ground of the ranch. Miguel stood on the porch, the cool air brushing against his face, and let his gaze sweep over the fields. Somewhere out there was the truth he needed, buried in old agreements, hidden in records long forgotten. Tomorrow he would start digging. Tonight, he would hold on to the sight of the land as it was whole, unbroken, and still his, no matter what the papers claimed. The next morning broke with a pale, watery light that struggled through a veil of low clouds, and for a moment the land looked as if it were holding its breath. Miguel had hardly slept. The night had been spent pacing from one room to the next, the sound of the wind through the trees outside the only rhythm to his restless thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that notice spread across his kitchen table, its neat lines of text delivering a blow meant to sever his connection to the place he had called home all his life. He had turned over every possible explanation, but the truth he kept circling back to was the same. This was no accident. It was planned, deliberate, and backed by people who believed they could get away with it. When the first hint of daylight crept into the house, Miguel poured himself a strong cup of coffee and leaned on the counter, watching the mist curl over the fields. He knew he couldn't fight what he didn't understand. The notice was only one piece of the puzzle, a final move in a game that must have started months and maybe years earlier. If there was a way to undo what had been set in motion, it wouldn't be found in the present. It would be buried in the past, somewhere in the long paper trail his family had left behind. And the keeper of that trail was his mother. Her house sat on the far edge of town, a small, single-story place she and his father had bought when they were newly married. Miguel drove there on the old county road, the tires humming steadily against the pavement as the land rolled past on either side. Pecan trees lined part of the way, their branches bare this time of year, their roots sunk deep into the soil like old sentinels. As he pulled into her driveway, the familiar sight of her rose bushes, stripped to thorny stems in winter, gave him an odd sense of comfort. His mother met him at the door, her dark eyes quick to scan his face. She had the kind of perception that came from decades of hard living. She could read a man's mood before he spoke a word. Miguel tried to smooth his expression, but whatever worry he carried must have already settled into his features. She ushered him in with the same brisk efficiency she had always had, the smell of coffee and fresh tortillas lingering in the air. The living room was just as he remembered, family photographs in mismatched frames covering the walls, a faded couch that had been patched more than once, a shelf lined with small ceramic figures she had collected over the years. They sat at the table, and Miguel laid out the notice for her to read. Her eyes moved slowly over the text, narrowing with each line. By the time she reached the end, her mouth was set in a tight line. She said nothing for a long moment, only rose from her chair and disappeared down the hall. When she returned, she was carrying a metal box, its lid scuffed and dented from years of handling. She set it down with a dull thud that seemed to echo in the small room. "This," she said simply, resting her hand on the lid, "is your father's record of everything that ever mattered about the ranch." Her voice carried a weight that needed no elaboration. Miguel drew the box toward him, his fingers feeling the cool metal, the stubborn resistance of the latch before it gave way. Inside lay a world of paper and ink, maps with creases worn white from folding and unfolding, legal documents yellowed at the edges, letters from lawyers and county officials, tax receipts neatly stacked and secured with brittle rubber bands. There were records here, going back before Miguel was born, some in English, some in Spanish, all in the careful handwriting of a man who had understood the value of proof. For hours they sat side by side, sorting through the contents. Miguel traced the lines of old maps that charted the ranch's expansion over the decades, following the boundary marks his grandfather had first set. He read the letters his father had written to the county during years of dispute over water rights, each one stating their case with unwavering clarity. The past unfolded in layers: drought years, lean years, seasons of growth and prosperity, and through it all, the unbroken thread of ownership. Then near the bottom of the box, Miguel found a folder marked in his father's handwriting with a single word: agreements. Inside were copies of deals made with neighbors, grazing leases, and then one thick document that felt different from the rest. He unfolded it and began to read. It was dated 1995. The name of the other party leapt out at him, a development company that had back then been laying out roads for a new subdivision on land adjacent to the ranch. The language was formal, but the meaning was unmistakable. In exchange for granting an easement through part of their property to allow the construction of 2 access roads, his father had received perpetual rights to the mineral and ground beneath several designated blocks of the subdivision. The map attached to the agreement showed the exact boundaries blocks that now lay in the heart of what was Pine Bluff Estates. Miguel stared at the map, then back at the agreement, the implications spreading through his mind like a slow sunrise. Those blocks included the street where Mariella Vance's house stood. It meant that, in the eyes of the law, She and the others living there were essentially tenants of the Ramos-Clark family, and those rights had no expiration date. His mother watched him closely, sensing the shift in his expression. "What is it?" she asked, but Miguel didn't answer right away. He took the time to read through the document twice more, checking every clause. There it was in black and white: perpetual, transferable, irrevocable without written consent of the Ramos-Clark owner. The agreement was signed, notarized, and filed with the county. He could feel the pulse of possibility quicken in his chest. This wasn't just a counter-argument to the HOA's claim, it was leverage. If the people trying to take his land wanted to stand on the letter of the law, then he could do the same, only with a sharper blade. But excitement gave way to caution. This would mean a fight, and fights like this had to be prepared for with care. Miguel gathered the agreement, the accompanying map, and a handful of supporting documents into a neat stack. He slipped them into a folder, his mind already moving to the next step. These papers were powerful, but they needed to be verified. He would take them to someone who could confirm their validity beyond any doubt, and then he would start building his case, piece by piece, until there was no room for the HOA to maneuver. By the time he left his mother's house, the sky had cleared, and the sun was sharp against the winter air. The metal box was back in its place under her bed, the folder tucked safely under his arm. As he drove away, the streets gave way once more to the open land, and he glanced toward the neat rows of houses on the horizon. Somewhere in those tidy blocks were the people who believed they could erase his family's claim with a forged piece of paper. He now knew they had been living atop ground they didn't truly own. That night, in the quiet of his kitchen, Miguel laid the documents out across the table once more. He studied the map until he could trace its lines from memory, matching it to the image of the subdivision he had carried in his mind for years. He knew every field, every fence, every dirt track leading toward those paved streets. And now he knew something else. He had a way to turn their own foundation into a fault line. All it would take was the right moment and the resolve to see it through. The ranch around him slept under the wide Texas sky, the cattle resting in their pens, the windmill groaning softly in the distance. Miguel sat in the lamplight, the weight of the paper before him more solid than any weapon he could hold. The past had given him what he needed. Now it was a matter of deciding how to use it. The fight was no longer just about defending the land. It was about showing those who thought they could take it that they had built their ambitions on ground that was never theirs to begin with. By the time the next morning's sun pulled itself over the far ridges, Miguel had already been awake for hours. The house smelled faintly of last night's coffee, reheated on the stove while he pored over the documents again, making certain nothing was left to chance. The 1995 agreement lay open in front of him, alongside the hand-drawn map his father had kept folded among the official papers. He had read it enough times to memorize the exact wording of the clauses, the placement of every initial, the neat ink signatures beneath the county seal. It was no longer just a curiosity from the past. It had become the keystone in a wall he was starting to build between himself and the people trying to strip away his family's legacy. Still, knowing what he held and proving its worth in the face of a determined enemy were different matters. The HOA was no small adversary. With Mariela Vance at its helm, it had the quiet confidence of people who believed they could bend rules to fit their designs. Miguel understood that walking into a fight like this without allies would be like riding into a storm without a coat, foolish and short-lived. He needed someone who knew the landscape, not just of the land, but of the county's politics and its hidden currents. He found that ally in the person he had been considering since the first moment he realized this wasn't a simple error: Roberto Suarez. Roberto had been the sheriff of Pine Bluff County for nearly 2 decades before retiring a few years back. A man who had once been as much a fixture in the courthouse as the flag over its front steps. He and Miguel's father had known each other well, and Miguel himself had grown up under Roberto's watchful eye. If there was anyone who could help him navigate the back channels of local records and the cautious whispers of old colleagues, it was him. Miguel called him late in the morning. The conversation was brief. Roberto didn't need details over the phone. They agreed to meet in town that afternoon. The air had turned sharp with a biting wind by the time Miguel parked outside the modest cafe where Roberto spent most of his mornings. The older man was already there, seated at a corner table with a cup of black coffee and a newspaper folded neatly beside him. His frame was still solid, his eyes quick and assessing as ever. Miguel laid out the notice from the HOA, the county clerk's confirmation, and finally the 1995 agreement. Roberto listened without interrupting, his brow furrowing deeper as the pieces fell into place. When Miguel finished, the retired sheriff leaned back, tapping one finger against the map. "They've overreached," he said at last, his voice low but certain. "If this is what you say it is, and I don't doubt it, you've got them in a corner. But you'll need more than paper to make it stick. You'll need to show, beyond any doubt, that this land wasn't abandoned for a single day." That became their next step. Over the following days, Miguel and Roberto began assembling proof. They drove the length of the ranch, photographing every pasture, every stretch of repaired fencing, every feed trough filled and maintained. They collected tax receipts from the past 3 years, marked paid in full. Roberto reached out to a handful of trusted contacts, old deputies, county workers, even a couple of folks in the tax assessor's office, asking quietly for anything that might back up Miguel's claim. Soon they had statements from neighbors who had seen Miguel cutting hay last summer, moving cattle in the spring, repairing storm damage just weeks earlier. While they worked, the HOA didn't remain idle. Word spread that Miguel was making trouble and standing in the way of progress. The language was careful, but the implication was always the same, that he was a stubborn holdout, unwilling to see the county move forward. Flyers began appearing in the subdivision, touting the benefits of the planned development: new shops, improved roads, more jobs. Miguel knew it was propaganda, but he also knew how easily people could be swayed when the promises were dressed in the right words. The pressure began to take a different shape when survey markers appeared along the boundary where the ranch met the subdivision. Bright plastic flags fluttered in the wind, each one a silent declaration that plans were already in motion. One morning, Miguel spotted a contractor's truck idling near the north fence line. He approached and asked the driver what he was doing. The man, young and uncertain, said they were marking for Phase 2 expansion. Miguel didn't raise his voice. He simply told the man he was on private property and would need to leave. The driver hesitated, then climbed back into his truck and left, but Miguel knew it wouldn't be the last such encounter. It was Roberto who suggested that they take the fight into the public eye before the HOA could control the narrative. "You need someone who can tell this straight, without the spin," he said, and Miguel knew exactly who he meant. There was a reporter at the Pine Bluff Chronicle, Elena Morales, who had made a name for herself digging into county contracts and local scandals. She wasn't afraid to publish names, and she had the skill to cut through the fog of half-truths the HOA was spreading. Miguel arranged to meet her at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Over coffee, he slid the folder across the table. Elena read in silence, her expression tightening with each page. By the time she set the papers down, Miguel could see the resolve in her eyes. She asked sharp, pointed questions, and he answered each with the patience of a man who understood the value of precision. Before they parted, she promised to verify the documents and speak to her editor. The article ran 3 days later, front page above the fold. The headline was direct: "Local rancher disputes HOA land claims, holds rights to subdivision blocks." The story outlined the HOA's sale of Miguel's land to the developer, the abandonment claim, and the existence of the 1995 agreement. Names were named, Mariella Vance among them. A photo of Miguel leaning on the north fence, the subdivision visible in the background, accompanied the piece. The impact was immediate. People in town began stopping Miguel in the feed store, the post office, the hardware shop, some to offer support, others to ask if it was really true that part of the subdivision sat on his family's land. In the subdivision itself, reactions were mixed. Some residents were furious, accusing him of threatening their homes. Others were quietly curious, wondering why the HOA had never mentioned any of this before. For Miguel, it wasn't about public sympathy. It was about shifting the balance, making it clear that he wasn't a faceless obstacle, but a man with history and legal standing. The article made it harder for the HOA to paint him as an outsider meddling in their affairs. And as more people learned the truth, the ice beneath the HOA's position began, slowly, to crack. At night, when the day's work on the ranch was done, and the phone had finally stopped ringing, Miguel would sit at the kitchen table, the documents spread before him like pieces of a puzzle. Each step forward, each photo, each statement, each line of the agreement was another piece locked into place. The fight ahead would be long, but he could feel momentum starting to shift. The land was still his, and now the story of that land was no longer hidden in a box under his mother's bed. It was out in the open where everyone could see it. And that, Miguel thought as he looked out into the dark fields, was how real change began. One truth at a time, breaking through the ice. The days that followed Elena Morales' article felt heavier, as though the very air around the ranch carried a new kind of charge. Miguel could sense it in the way strangers looked at him in town, sometimes with open respect, sometimes with suspicion, and in the way phone calls came more often now. Some offering help, others laced with threats and accusations. The line between friend and enemy blurred, but he had expected that. A fight like this wasn't going to be clean. It would draw lines through the community and force people to stand on one side or the other. Roberto arrived at the ranch early one morning, his truck kicking up dust along the driveway. He stepped out carrying a folder of his own and a look that said he had come with news worth hearing. Over coffee at the kitchen table, he explained that a lawyer named Victor Salazar, a man Miguel knew only by reputation, had agreed to take the case. Salazar had a history of handling property disputes, and more importantly, he had never been known to back down from a fight with deep-pocketed developers. When he'd read through the 1995 agreement, he had told Roberto without hesitation that the HOA and the developer had walked themselves into a trap. They had acted as though those rights didn't exist, and now they would have to explain themselves in court. Salazar moved quickly. Within 2 days, he filed a petition to void the sale of Miguel's land, attaching the agreement, the county's original records, the photographs, tax receipts, and witness statements. At the same time, he prepared a series of formal landlord notices for the residents of the subdivision blocks named in the agreement. These were not idle warnings. They were legal documents stating that the land beneath their homes was owned by Miguel, and that without his consent, they had no standing to occupy it. The notices were careful in tone, no immediate threats of eviction, but a demand for acknowledgement and the initiation of rental agreements. The reaction was swift and chaotic. Cars slowed as they passed the ranch, some drivers honking in support, others shaking their heads. In the subdivision, neighbors gathered in small knots on sidewalks and driveways, the bright paper of the notices in their hands. Word spread quickly that the HOA had never told them about any such rights. Fear and anger rippled through the community, and not all of it was directed at Miguel. Many began to question Mariela Vance's leadership and the quiet authority she had wielded for years. Miguel stayed clear of the subdivision during those first days, letting the tension build where it needed to. He focused on the ranch, keeping his work steady as though nothing around him had changed. But each night, Roberto would stop by with updates, whispers from inside the HOA board. Rumors that some members were considering breaking ranks. The cracks were widening. Then came the first court date. The Pine Bluff County Courthouse, with its weathered limestone facade and creaking wooden benches, had seen its share of disputes, but few with the attention this one had drawn. Reporters from the Chronicle were there, along with a camera crew from a regional news station. Miguel entered wearing a clean white shirt and the same belt buckle his father had worn to sign the deed transfer years ago. Salazar carried the thick folder of evidence like a weapon. Inside, the opposing table was crowded. Mariela sat at the center, her expression tightly controlled, flanked by 2 lawyers in sharp suits. On the other side of her was a representative from the development company, his manner one of polite detachment, as though he were merely an observer. The judge, a woman known for her precise reading of contracts, took her seat and called the hearing to order. Salazar spoke first, laying out the facts with a calm authority that made each point feel like a nail driven into place. He described the chain of ownership, the lack of any agreement placing the ranch under the HOA's authority, the falsity of the abandonment claim, and finally the 1995 agreement that gave Miguel perpetual rights to the land beneath the named subdivision blocks. When he finished, the room was quiet except for the shuffle of papers. The opposing counsel tried to argue that the agreement was irrelevant to the matter at hand, that it was a separate issue from the sale of the ranch land. Salazar countered smoothly, pointing out that ignoring those rights was part of the same pattern of bad faith that had led to the attempted sale. The judge listened without revealing her thoughts, But when she announced that all documents related to the 1995 agreement would be admitted into evidence, Miguel knew they had cleared an important hurdle. After the hearing, as people filed out, Mariela passed close enough from Miguel to catch the faint scent of her perfume. She didn't look at him, but the stiffness in her posture spoke volumes. The first battle had not gone her way. Over the next week, Salazar's office became a clearinghouse for every scrap of evidence they could find. Miguel spent hours there, reviewing photographs, signing affidavits, and listening as Roberto relayed more news from the subdivision. The pressure on the HOA board was growing unbearable. Residents were demanding answers, and several were openly calling for Mariela's resignation. The development company, sensing that the project was in jeopardy, began pulling its survey teams back from the boundary lines. It was during this time that an unexpected envelope arrived at the ranch. Heavy cream paper, embossed with the logo of a Dallas law firm, containing a settlement offer. The figure was large enough to make most men pause, payment in exchange for Miguel's agreement to drop all claims, including the landlord notices. Salazar read it, then looked at Miguel with a faint smile. "They're nervous," he said. "This is the kind of number you put on the table when you see the ground slipping under you." Miguel didn't hesitate. "I'm not selling," he said. "This isn't about the money." 2 days later, the judge issued her ruling on the preliminary petition. The sale of Miguel's ranch was voided, pending a full trial. The county clerk was ordered to restore the title to his name, and all development plans were frozen. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a victory they could build on. The very next morning, Salazar sent the landlord notices again, this time with the weight of the court's decision behind them. Within 48 hours, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. The outcome was decisive. Mariela was removed as president, and 2 of her closest allies resigned. A new acting president, Sharon Bell, reached out to Salazar directly, proposing a settlement. The terms were simple. The HOA would issue a formal apology, recognize Miguel's rights to the subdivision blocks, and pledge never to contest his ownership of the ranch again. In return, Miguel would drop the landlord actions against residents who signed acknowledgement forms within 30 days. It wasn't everything he might have demanded. There would be no formal admission of wrongdoing in the abandonment claim, but it was enough, more than enough. He had his land, his rights, and their public surrender on the key points. Salazar put it plainly. "This is a win. Take it, and let them wear the shame themselves." Miguel agreed. The signing took place at the courthouse, in front of reporters and townsfolk. He stood on the steps afterward, answering a few questions for the cameras. "This was never about revenge," he said. "It was about standing up when someone in power thinks they can take what's yours. You don't let that slide." The weeks that followed were quieter, though not without their echoes. In town, people still talked about the case, some with admiration, others with lingering resentment. In the subdivision, the new board began working to mend the trust that had been broken, but the memory of how close they had come to losing their homes remained fresh. A few residents, braver than the rest, came to the ranch to thank Miguel personally. One older couple brought a pecan pie, setting it on his table with shy smiles. "We didn't know," the woman said. "If we had, we would have spoken up sooner." Miguel only nodded. The people he had wanted to hold accountable were not them. On warm evenings, when the work was done and the cattle were settled for the night, Miguel would walk the fence line toward the north boundary. From there, he could see the subdivision's rooftops catching the last light, their neat rows a reminder of the fight that had nearly cost him everything. The land beneath those homes was still his, and now it always would be. That thought didn't bring him pride so much as it brought a deep, enduring calm. One night as he stood there, Roberto came up beside him. "You know," he said, "you could have taken their money and walked away." Miguel looked out across the fields, the grass whispering in the wind. "Money comes and goes," he said. "This land, this stays. My father bled for it. My mother worked every inch of it. It's the one thing I can't replace." The fight was over, at least for now, but the lesson it had carried would stay with him as long as he drew breath. That power only works if people are too afraid or too tired to stand against it, and that sometimes, even when you're alone, standing your ground is enough to turn the tide. The ranch was safe, the family trust had been honored, and under the broad Texas sky, Miguel knew that what had been theirs would remain theirs, for as long as there was someone willing to defend it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch our next video for another powerful journey, and explore our other videos for more stories like this. And please, share this one with someone who needs to hear it.